Record. There we go. I would like to take a moment to thank the Townsend Center for the Humanities for their continued support of this annual lecture series and our working group. The working group aims to connect scholars and community members with diverse interests in Occitanio. We are particularly invested in raising awareness of Occitan issues among English-speaking audiences. The theme for this year is Occitan in the Media. To this end, I am pleased to welcome Danís Chadeuil as our speaker today. Danís has over a decade of experience working in Occitan cultural and media and is currently editor-in-chief of the cultural magazine Lo Diari. In the talk today, he will discuss some of the advantages and challenges to making media in a minority language such as Occitan. Then he will speak on the emergence of video game culture in Occitan. Without further ado, let us welcome Danís Chadeuil.
Well, hello everyone. Do you hear me? It's fine?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to talk about subjects that I am passionate about. I apologize in advance if I have any difficulties. I use English in my daily life in many activities, but I don't really have the opportunity to practice it. So first, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. What we agreed with Oliver was that today I was going to talk about two specific topics that are a big part of my work and research. So the first part of this talk will be about Occitan language media, and the second part will be about video games and the connections that can be made with Occitan. If these two subjects seem different, we will see, and this is the meaning of my reflection, that they can in fact be linked. In both cases, when we speak of Occitan, we speak of a minority language and culture, and the creation and promotion of these languages and cultures is often a challenge and requires considerable effort. To tell you more about the Occitan media as a whole, I will begin by speaking about what I know personally, Lo Diari, of which I have been editor-in-chief for 4 years, and then we will widen a little. In a few key facts, Lo Diari is a cultural magazine entirely in Occitan. It is published every 2 months, each time around a given theme, and offers a variety of columns, subjects, and points of view around literature, music, movies, arts, sports, and also new technologies or video games. A notable fact that may interest us today is that Lo Diari was originally an associative newsletter, an internal document of the association that publishes it, the Institute of Occitan Studies, or IEO. The transformation of Lo Diari to a full-color magazine aimed at the general public is due to the will of the previous editor, Sébastien Pugin, as well as the observation of a lack of this type of publication in Occitan. Here, the reference model, at least at the beginning of the thinking, is that of the French dominant culture, which produces many press organs of reviews, chronicles, cultural analysis. We can quote, for example, Télérama or Les Inrocks. However, in the final goal, somewhat unattainable given our means, would be to reach these publications. The principle of Lo Diari remains its Occitanity. That is to say, a vision of the world necessarily quite different from these publications. This implies decentering the gaze, looking at, making visible and promoting the cultural creation of Occitan expression. One of our convictions will be to consider that the Occitan cultural production is worth all the others. But at the same time, we do not forbid ourselves to talk about cultural creations coming from what some people call mass culture: American films, Netflix, or Amazon series, video games, etc. Even in this case, our treatment will be different. We do it in Occitan language, with the eye of people who speak this language, live this culture, and also live the culture of everybody, a culture from which it is anyway difficult to escape. For us, it will be the French culture, necessarily dominant with this absolutely hegemonic language, and a more globalized culture in which we are going to find, according to the times and to the patterns of cultural domination, features of American, Japanese, or European culture. From my point of view, to deny as Occitan's linguistic and cultural domination is to bury our heads in the sand. So rather than ignore it and focus in Lo Diari only on what Occitans produce, we try to ask questions, to build bridges, to show that the quality of a work does not depend on the size of the community that produces it, and that the curiosity that leads us to nourish our minds can be turned as much towards others as towards ourselves. Choosing to consider that one can literally speak about anything but in Occitan may seem trivial, but is not. For many people in France, including its own native speakers, Occitan will refer to the past, and thus to certain very precise activities, mainly farming. To show that a minority language can be used to finally describe the world of today as well as that of yesterday is to turn the tables on preconceived ideas and to advance towards a form of recognition. This consideration is absolutely not specific to Lo Diari. It's the intellectual foundation of all Occitan speaking media, but also of all publishers and producers of cultural creations in minority languages. One sentence to summarize this idea: as long as we can describe and build the world around us, we will not disappear. I have just spoken about an editorial line that I know and described a somewhat ideal situation with this theory. Between what we wish to do and what we manage to do, there is a world, and many difficulties come in the way. I will now take a step back to consider the Occitan media question as a whole, with its difficulties. I'll try to give some tracks that we set up or try to set up at Lo Diari to circumvent them. There is a lot of talk in France about a crisis in the press. People buy fewer newspapers, read less, titles disappear. In reality, the crisis of the print media affects less the magazine press and the specialized press if there is a relative monopoly in the theme, and we can consider that it's the case for the titles in Occitan. So, in reality, the crisis of the press may not concern the Occitan press directly, but may hide another crisis: the decrease in the number of speakers and therefore of people able to read Occitan. According to the latest sociolinguistic survey on Occitan, an average 7 to 8% of people know how to read Occitan. 62% of them read, 16% of them at least once a week. That's not much, but I'm convinced that there is a bag for now irreducible of people who practice a militant reading in Occitan, and that, proportionally, it decreases less quickly than the readership in French. But here again, we must mitigate these data. Fewer people read books or press titles, but the written word is increasingly present in our lives. So the act of reading is still extremely present. This simply means that the medium has changed. And of course, this change of medium must also be understood by the Occitan media. The first response is a web version of the written title, which Lo Diari is doing, once again following the dominant model of the French national press. And also a coda key. And we can see that Journalet, which exists mainly as a news site, occupies a central place. A central place, especially since the disappearance of La Semaine, an Occitan weekly that has, among other problems, had trouble making the transition to digital. With Lo Diari, we think that we need to go further than the simple binomial paper and site. It is extremely long and tedious, but we are trying to advance this idea of existing as a cross-media tool, a term that we borrow from the marketing field. To try to define this concept, let us say that the will is to offer an access to the Occitan language and culture by creating an editorial universe, by declining it on the most possible supports, by marrying the multiplication of the habits of consumption of the press, the disparity of the public, and the permanent emergence of new media. This is a very difficult thing to do as it requires constant monitoring, great adaptability, time, and people capable of helping with this. Let's stop for a moment to consider the first meaning of cross-media, the fact of crossing media. What we see emerging is the need to pluralize for our survival. The paper edition can no longer guarantee the survival of a title alone. It is therefore necessary to invest in other fields, which perhaps are already occupied by other Occitan media. Let's be clear, I don't personally believe in competition in this matter, more in the possibility of collaboration. This leads me to point out another problem of the Occitan media environment: the relative isolation of each structure and the difficulty of getting together or working together, except for a few occasional partnerships. This lack of structure is also felt internally within each media. Most of the time, volunteer work is the driving force, and it takes highly motivated people to keep the project going, which personalizes it and raises the question of its sustainability. Economically, the Occitan media can count on public funding from local authorities, but depending on the community, this funding is sometimes poorly secured and can be put at risk in the event of a major political change. In France, it's an element of context here. In France, it's not abnormal for media to benefit from public funding. A very large majority of press titles are thus helped, including those that usually show their hostility to this model. On another hand, the main media in France go through a very comprehensive government program called Press Aid, to receive these funds. The aid is divided into several funds depending on the nature and the projects of the company. It will be innovation, distribution, pluralism. All these funds are theoretically accessible to titles in regional languages. This is specified everywhere, and it always surprises me given the lack of voluntarism of the French state towards the historical languages of its territory. Well, I said theoretically because the problem is that to be able to claim these aids, it's necessary to prove a solid structure, to have several employees, a significant readership. In fact, I don't know any Occitan media that can carry this kind of project, and I doubt that any minority language media in France can do it. This remains a paradox that sums up the situation. where we need help, there is none, but there is help where we cannot go. I would like to end this list of problems with linguistic considerations related to Occitan media. To create a media in Occitan is, in a predominantly monolingual context, to take the risk of not being understood. It's thus to take the risk to see its public reduced, which returns to the difficulties listed above as for the perenniality of the titles. There are currently several ways to respond to this. The first one is the injection of dose of French. Akodaki, for example, a Provençal newspaper, always offers certain articles in French and quite regularly communicates in French when a new paper is released. On some radio stations, such as Radio Languedoc or Radio Occitania, the two languages are used side by side, sometimes even with others. The very recent L'ABC del Saber offers summaries in French and English before its feature articles. Well, the second option is what I would call educational. That is to say, providing everything needed to access the understanding. Activation of subtitles on Octélé, some France Bleu chronicles, so radio chronicles. The third one is what I call the linguistic bath, which is the solution practiced by Journalet and Lo Diari. Here, all the proposed contents are in Occitan. First of all, in order not to reproduce in small scale the usual pattern of linguistic domination, these titles will consider it welcome to organize a safe space of normality for the minority language. This means, on the other end, that it's up to the reader to make the effort of understanding. For Lo Diari, we try to support this effort by doing what we call linguistic mediation, a set of tools to facilitate access to content in an abnormal language. Among these tools, we include the care given to linguistic harmonization, the choice of lexicon or the presence of glossaries, that you have an example, or for the most basic elements, and many more. But we also include an essential element for Lo Diari, the graphic aspect. We work to ensure that the form in which the content is presented gives the first visual element of understanding of the content and constitutes a welcoming and comfortable reading environment for someone who will not be at ease and will already make personal efforts with the language. It's also, more pragmatically, to make people want to read the magazine, subscribe to it, show it around, and show what's possible to do technically and visually in Occitan. To illustrate all this, I cannot resist sharing with you a few pages from a project parallel to Lo Diari, carried out with the Public Office of Occitan Language, OPLO, a special edition especially intended for high school students and young people. We are working on the language, the visual aspect, and all the cultural notions that I presented above, the links between majority and minority cultures with common references that allow us to address them, but to be able to do it in Occitan. And that's it for the little tour of the thoughts that go along with the development of Lo Diari. I could have kept on talking about it for a long time, but I didn't want to drown you in numbers, nor did I want to tell you in detail about all the projects we have. I just wanted to describe you some of the realities and difficulties that we face. Maybe questions are already coming to your mind. We will have some time after my presentation to come back to this. We're now going to talk about video games There is no transition as such, but you will have noticed that there is a link between these two subjects. Each time we try to be contemporary, in touch with our time. And of course, this is a major issue when it comes to minority languages. Let me get some water. And here we go again. Let's be clear, until now, Occitan and video games were not a subject. There was no link. However, the purpose of my talk today is to say that this is changing and that there are clear opportunities in a favorable context. To introduce what I'm going to talk about, I'd like to say that I'm personally very interested in video games, both as a player for many years, but also intellectually and professionally. I've been reading about them since my studies, starting with the specialized press, in which I sometimes find influence for Lo Diari. The circle is closed once. I have written more than 150 chronicles in the last 10 years on various games, each time in Occitan. This is how I became a contributor to Lo Diari before becoming editor-in-chief. So, why video games? And why is video gaming important for us? A quick look back. During the French presidential campaign of 2022, last year, a candidate declared very seriously and very honestly, video games are a total art. They mix musical, literary, cinematographic creation. This is a good definition, which we can complete a little. From an artistic point of view, the video game is a recent art, which, like all arts, combines the heritage of its predecessors and adds its own innovation. So yes, the video game is both visual arts, drawing, animation, graphic design. It's also literary writing, narration, stories, dialogues. It is also staging and staging techniques, direct hairs of cinema, which itself was a direct hair of theater. It's also music, a soundtrack, and sometimes dubbing actors. Moreover, one will be able to find in video games many references to other forms like architecture, sculpture, comics. And its innovations, its specificity, which makes it a new and different art, is the notion of interactivity. To define it very quickly, interactivity represents the possibility of acting on a program or the feeling of this possibility. Video games provide a narrative space in which the player can generate causes and then observe the effects. It's this social element that creates the fascination for video games and explains their current success. All these points may not be present together in a given work, but the video game as a whole will use all of this, which is why we find more narrative works, visual work, contemplative works, philosophical works, with degrees of interaction that range from the linearity of literature to the feeling of total freedom, within the limits of what has been technically set up by the creator of school, of course. So far, I've talked about the video game as an art. In reality, it's a way of considering it among other possibilities. It's a bit like cinema. If a video game creation or a cinematographic creation can be the result of an artistic will, it can also not be. So here are other ways of considering and looking at video games. An art, a medium, that is to say, an artistic material intended to convey an artist's vision, a cultural good, an economical good, or a consumer product, and more. One can also consider that video games are all of these at the same time. This is what I do, and it's for this protean aspect that I believe that video games can value minority facts. And you can see why. It's a cultural good that can reuse existing cultures. It's a medium capable of transmitting knowledge, language, etc. And to do it to a very large number of people simultaneously. When we speak of good, of product, to designate the video game, it is not in vain. It is reported that there are more than 3.2 billion gamers in the world, which represent just over 40% of the world's population, for an economic weight of $184 billion. That's huge. The video game industry represents more than books and even more than the music and film industries combined. This makes it the leading cultural asset by far, and therefore a very good reason to try to connect it to the Occitan language or culture. Let's talk about chronology and recent history. Video games are a relatively recent medium which evolves very quickly. Even the youngest witness rapid technological and industrial advances. The question of translation is closely linked to technical limitations. Until the appearance of the CD medium, it was very difficult to offer a game in more than a handful of written languages, especially since the development time was much shorter. Today, the technical limitation does not exist anymore, or almost. Games can be published in many more languages. However, the main motivation is still financial. If money is invested in a translation, that's because it is assumed that there is a market of players of a given language so that the investment is profitable. So in any case, the majority languages in the world remain the majority languages in the games. It's therefore understandable that the first attempts at translating video games into minority languages were carried out in an artisanal manner. There has been a particularly marked boom in amateur translation around the year 2010 and a successful game, which is Minecraft. Thanks to the community, there are versions of Minecraft in Occitan, Catalan, Basque. A wiki dedicated to the game counts more than 120 of them. The disadvantage of community translations, if I may say, it is that they are not official, so they cannot easily be integrated into the game. Essentially usable on computer, the only support allowing the modification of the files of the programs. They are thus reserved for a small part of the players, those which will have made the conscious and voluntary choice to pass such game in such language and will have had the technical knowledge for that. For minority languages, it is therefore DIY, as for any type of action aiming at the preservation of the promotion of its language. An example of all this is a translation I did in 2019, that of Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley, I guess. More than a translation with Vow Seren, I was interested in making a localization, that is to say, a cultural adaptation. Stardew Valley is a simulation of agricultural and social life, and its theme evoked things that were, to me, very much linked to the Occitan language. Life on farm, animals, crops. I choose to integrate a whole bunch of Occitan cultural elements. Literary, mythological, folkloric references. I don't need to go into detail since everything is available online, including a presentation file of which I show you a few pages here. I wanted, despite the DIY aspect, to make people talk about the translation and about Occitan. Using a game that has sold more than 20 million copies worldwide was a way to ride a global wave with a regional specificity. There was a good reception from the game community, which was able to at least discover the existence of Occitan. On Stardew Valley, someone pointed out that the video game was excellent for fixing the vocabulary of a language and promoting learning by functioning as a giant interactive picture book. As a result of this idea, I used the assets of the original game to create an encyclopedia, listing all the objects in the game and their translation into Occitan. I don't know exactly how many people in total played Vau Sereno, but I do know that several dozen people spent some time there and were able to learn vocabulary in that language while having fun, which is very important. Parallel to Vau Sereno or Little After, other people started to translate video games, often young people, structured in a rather small community meeting and helping each other on Discord. It is the same structuring in a different proportion as the Catalans, who are currently adapting video games on an almost industrial scale. For example, there is a translation of The Forest and others still in the works. Apart from the craft work, I could see that there was a will within the video game industry to use and value minority language and culture. This will is not born from nothing, and it's probably not born or not only from an interest for minority languages and culture. The video game market is nowadays saturated. Many games are released at the same time. Gamers don't know which way to turn, and the specialized press has difficulties in sorting out all the proposals. For the studios, and mainly the smaller ones, it has become vital to stand out from the crowd. On this subject, a very interesting article from France Culture, a French radio station, was published a few months ago. We learned that the 3/4 of the French releases are independent games with a certain freedom of creation and a personal aspect. The tendency is to create games with a marked on-core imaginary based on the principle that a very local imaginary can, given the audience, touch other people everywhere in the world. It is a form of counterpunch to the industry's tradition of creating universes with no real cultural anchorage or precisely too well-known and too well-traveled, such as the US, Japan, and a few tourist locations or destinations. The notion of exoticism appears, as well as its relativity, to underline the fact that what is exotic to an American may not be so to a Japanese or a European. Hence the idea of valorizing unknown and marginal places or cultural elements. For me, this marks a considerable paradigm shift in the way of making video games. It's almost the recovery of an idea that many Occitans know, that the local can claim to be universal. I would like to share with you 3 recent games that have in common a consideration of minority languages and cultures in works with a universal scope, but that do so with different approaches. The first one is Mundaun, released in 2021. It's a horrific first-person game set in the Swiss Alps at the foot of a mountain called Mundaun. The player will encounter a number of local folklore figures and will be immersed in life as it is lived in the remote corners of the canton of the Guison. The special feature of the game, apart from its black and white pencil graphics, is that it is dubbed solely in Romansh, a language spoken by some 60,000 people in Switzerland. The choice of location, language, or graphic style is clearly made to reinforce the strangeness of the game, this timelessness that leads to unease. For a German speaker or for a Latin speaker, Romansh is both familiar and exotic. Its creator, Michel Ziegler, has made a choice that is both artistic and militant, since it allows the whole world to hear a language spoken by a very small number of people. I think that you can hear a bit of Romansh here. The second one is Chia, released on March 21. It is an adventure and exploration game on a fictitious archipelago, but very strongly inspired by New Caledonia. Here too, elements of Kanak folklore are reused in the gameplay, such as the possibility of sending one's soul to take control of animals and objects, and the characters speak Dueu, one of the languages spoken in New Caledonia. Because of the small number of speakers, local people had to be recorded in their language to dub the game. This creates a unique sound atmosphere and brings the characters to life. One of the goals is to make the players feel like they are back in their childhood, and the presence of the developer's native language is a partial answer to that. The last one. As I speak, the game called Dordogne is not yet released, but I can talk about it since I was involved in the project. As you can tell from the name, it's a game set in the Dordogne part of France. Mimi, a 30-something woman living in Paris, arrives at the house of her grandmother, who has recently passed away. She knows that she had a nice vacation there as a child, but she can't remember why. She will have to find her memories and relive them to understand what happened. Like the other two games, this one stands out first of all by its unique graphic style. Here it is watercolors. The choice of its name is also interesting since it is very rare, given the worldwide distribution of video games, not to have a game title in a dominant language, usually English, less often Japanese. It's an assertive choice, as art director Cédric Babouche has indicated in several interviews. Publishers wanted them to rename the game because it was difficult to pronounce. He insisted on keeping it for the same reason, because he saw that it was exotic for the rest of the world. Especially since he didn't choose just any place. The Dordogne is the third largest tourist department in France. It already benefits from this attraction, and the game intends to take advantage of it. In May 2020, Cédric Babouche was interviewed by a local radio station. In it, he says, "There will be only one version, and it will be in Occitan. It will then be subtitled in other languages. The dialogues will be spoken in Occitan. This allows to show that this language is still there. There are so many games that invent false languages, that our language, for the rest of the world, it will be a language that is known in France." If this will was kept until the end, several factors, including the support of a big publisher and the interest aroused in the US and in Japan, pushed the game team to integrate other languages. However, the translation I did received a special treatment from them. Until recently, Cédric Babouche said he was proud to bring this Occitan version to the whole world. And the announcement of what is a first for Occitan and a first for the minority languages of France, along with Chia, has been welcomed here too with great interest by the video game localization community, by the industry, or by language lovers. What is interesting about Dordogne is that this Occitan version is at the crossroads of several ambitions: an artistic will, a clear commitment to linguistic diversity, and a material need to stand out by adding what I call an extra soul. It is here that we act the fact that a language or a minority culture can constitute an added value to a creation which claims to reach the universal. There is no coincidence for me that games like Chia and Dordogne were released almost simultaneously, with recent projects like Moondown or Never Alone, which I could have told you about in detail. I have given you some keys to understand why and how we are seeing the emergence of these opportunities for our languages and cultures. I believe that we are witnessing the beginnings of something that the contours of a new space of existence of the minority fact are undoubtedly taking shape, freeing itself especially from political context unfavorable to minority language as in France. Of course, I don't want to predict the future, but we will have to be attentive and, I insist, be able to support all the similar initiatives that will emerge. And that's it. Thank you for listening to me. Well, if you have question, I think that's
Thank
that's
you,
the time. Yeah.
Thank you, Danís. This was excellent. We will do questions now. If you have a question, you can free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Um, you can put it in English, French, Occitan, um, and we will deal with that. We'll give you your answer to your question. If you would not like your name in the chat, you can always send me a direct message and I can relay the question to the audience. Annie.
Oui, merci beaucoup, c'était très intéressant. Is it okay if I ask in French?
Sure. Fine by
Oliver,
me.
oui. Ok, ok. Donc, merci beaucoup. En fait, j'ai plein de questions, mais juste pour commencer, je voulais vous demander si vous pourriez parler un petit peu plus de l'influence des autres formes et traditions culturelles occitanes et régionales dans le développement des jeux vidéo. Vous avez évoqué le folklore, par exemple. Est-ce qu'il y a des exemples d'une réécriture, une réinvention de certaines traditions, soit littéraires, soit musicales, dans ces formes de jeux vidéo, dans ces nouvelles formes de médias? Et aussi, je voulais savoir un petit peu plus sur le contexte, en fait, des journaux régionaux en langue régionale en France et comment votre journal se compare avec d'autres exemples. Je pense notamment aux journaux en breton ou en langue basque. Si vous avez des liens de support et d'entraide entre ces journaux, ou si vous travaillez d'une manière plus ou moins indépendante selon les régions et les langues régionales.
Je vais répondre par la deuxième question. Après, on reprendra dans l'ordre. Je l'ai mentionné à un endroit, c'est un constat que je fais, qui est presque un regret, la difficulté qu'il y a pour les titres de presse en langue régionale, plus généralement pour toutes les structures et les initiatives en langue régionale, en langue minoritaire en France, à travailler avec les autres, par manque de temps et de moyens humains. La revue que je présentais, celle dont je suis rédacteur en chef, elle existe depuis très peu de temps. Donc elle est en phase de développement, ce qui fait que ça complique un petit peu les liens qu'on peut avoir avec les autres. C'est-à-dire qu'on a finalement peu de temps à consacrer à sortir de notre espace, de notre bulle. Donc c'est une difficulté. Je pense que pour les autres aussi, je vois qu'il y a des gens qui sont à Journalette, c'est un peu aussi difficile d'avoir des partenariats globaux. Je pense aussi que la presse occitane est pas du tout la plus représentative sur le territoire français, que la presse basque existe, elle est encore très active, ou la presse bretonne, parce que c'est eux, ils arrivent encore à avoir de la presse d'actualité dans leur langue, ce qui en Occitan n'est quasiment plus le cas avec ce que je mentionnais, c'est-à-dire la disparition de l'ACEMAN. Aujourd'hui, il y a Journalette, mais vous n'avez plus de journal papier très régulier qui va parler de société et d'actualité en Occitan. Donc ça, c'était pour la deuxième question. Sur la première question, il faut bien savoir que je fais cette intervention à la croisée des chemins. Hier, le jeu vidéo en Occitan, ça n'est rien, ça n'existe pas. On commence. Donc la question de la réutilisation du folklore, c'est compliqué parce que sur Dordogne, ça réutilise, on va dire, un visuel et un imaginaire. Il y a une réutilisation. Je peux pas trop en parler tant que le jeu n'est pas sorti. Il y a une réutilisation d'un élément folklorique et mythologique très typique du département de la Dordogne. Voilà. Après, moi, ce que j'ai fait avec Vaos Seren, l'autre projet plus artisanal dont je parlais précédemment, c'est des réutilisations dès que j'en avais l'opportunité de créatures, ou de créatures mythologiques occitanes, de mythes de manière généraux, mais pas de travail sur la musique notamment, ça c'était pas possible, pour des raisons techniques surtout. Voilà, je sais pas si ça répond à la question en partie. Mais ça veut dire qu'il y a un espace en fait pour une réutilisation ultérieure de toute la culture occitane dans le jeu vidéo. Et que là, ce que je décris moi, c'est juste les prémices, le début. Voilà.
D'accord. Ouais, c'est très bien. Merci beaucoup.
Avec plaisir.
Are there other questions? I think I will ask one based off this comment in the chat. So you've mentioned that it's the young people who are involved in some of these efforts to create video games. Do you think, or how do you reconcile this this dynamic with the fact that in academic circles, these creations by young people and these what you might call personal initiatives are often either unknown or unexplored? Or do you not think that's the case?
That's the case. That's a problem. There a generational gap, if I may say. Some video games is it's not a young media. 40 years of video games, but the interest now for translation, localization is often in the youngest generations. And for now, the academics, the academical world seem not to be interested in that matter. So there are people who are doing things on their own and other initiatives more usual for Occitan in the other side. And I think myself I'm in between for now, as I'm not too young and not too old or not too academic, may I say. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. We have any other questions? Uh,
J'aurais une autre question si on n'a pas d'autres. Donc, vous avez mentionné le côté pédagogique des jeux vidéo et le potentiel en fait de l'utiliser comme outil d'enseignement des langues, qui est une question bien sûr très importante pour les langues minoritaires. Donc, je voulais juste un peu savoir si, parce que moi, je travaille sur des questions sur le breton et la Bretagne, et je sais qu'il y a les écoles d'Iwan où on enseigne la langue bretonne. Et donc, je pourrais imaginer ou envisager une éventuelle partenariat entre des jeux vidéo et des institutions d'enseignement de langue, et potentiellement aussi des subventions en fait, qui seraient liées donc à l'enseignement. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est quelque chose que vous envisagez ou sur lequel vous réfléchissez, ou d'autres avec qui vous travaillez sur ces projets-là.
Alors, je réfléchis un peu à ces questions-là. Ceci dit, je fais attention à une chose qui est une tendance aussi, on pourra en parler, une tendance générale pour les langues et cultures minoritaires, c'est tout mettre sur l'éducation et l'enseignement et cette transmission dans un cadre scolaire. Ce qui, moi, m'intéresse, c'est tout ce qu'on arrive à construire comme culture, c'est-à-dire en dehors du cadre scolaire. Le jeu vidéo, sa vocation première, ce n'est pas d'être un, un outil pédagogique. Pour moi, c'est d'être un bien culturel. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui va nourrir l'esprit, qui va amuser aussi beaucoup, hein, ça reste un jeu. Et de le faire en occitan, c'est aussi faire exister l'occitan en dehors du cercle scolaire. C'est d'autant plus intéressant. Et je me méfie aussi, du coup, de ce qui a été fait par le passé avec certains logiciels dits ludo-éducatifs, où en fait l'éducatif prenait le pas sur le ludo, sur le ludique. Donc, on en sort un petit peu de ça. C'est une époque qui est terminée, même si certaines institutions utilisent encore des studios de jeux vidéo pour développer des applications internes. Ça reste un monde un petit peu à part. Donc, je ferai un petit peu attention à ça. Moi, tout mon travail autour de l'occitan et de la culture occitane et de sa langue, c'est sans jamais mettre un pied dans le milieu de l'éducation, justement, parce que je tiens à montrer qu'on peut encore faire d'autres choses en dehors, pour le reste de la société, pour les gens qui ne sont pas dans le cursus scolaire ou pour les gens qui l'ont quitté. Pour une langue minoritaire, et surtout pour l'occitan, c'est très difficile d'exister une fois qu'on a terminé son parcours. On a fait l'école calandrette, c'est l'équivalent des diwan, peut-être, ou de l'enseignement bilingue public, parce que ça existe aussi. On a fait des cours optionnels d'occitan au collège, au lycée, on l'a peut-être fait un petit peu à la faculté, et après, il n'y a plus rien. Pour les jeunes adultes, c'est le plus difficile, c'est de garder ce contact à la langue. Donc pour ça, il faut des supports qui sont adaptés aux jeunes adultes. Donc il faut une vie culturelle, en fait. Il faut pas des trucs directement pédagogiques ou éducationnels, mais des supports de vie de la langue et de la culture. Et des supports, si c'est du jeu, c'est du film, c'est des séries, c'est tout ça. Et c'est ça qui va faire que la culture occitane et la langue occitane va résister, en réalité. Et c'est un complément, de toute façon, nécessaire à toutes les dynamiques d'enseignement. C'est une réponse très
Merci
personnelle, hein,
beaucoup.
par contre. Ouais.
Non, 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 mais c'est très intéressant, et c'est un point important, en fait, je pense, à souligner, c'est que c'est pas de sortir un petit peu de ce schéma, en fait, et de penser la langue comme uniquement, enfin, les enjeux de la langue uniquement à travers la transmission de la langue. Je pense que c'est un point important à souligner, en effet. Merci.
I've seen a question in the chat. What niche of cross media do you believe to be missing still for Occitan consumers? Basically everything. But since you ask, I think there is a lot of things to do in audio, in audio support, in podcast, like you do, and it's a good thing. I think that we have to manage to follow the mood, the vibe, the world as it's going. And if we watch series, TV shows in English or in French, we must try to have it in Occitan, basically. So basically everything. And another question, you mentioned that video game companies were showing increasing interest in minority languages as a USP. I don't know what is a USP, but does this concern mainly minority languages from dominant culture or also regional languages, India, Africa? I think that is a global movement, clearly. I've shown Never Alone. There was a slide. I didn't quote it in the 3 games because it's a bit old now, but for me it's a mark or something important. It was a game centered on the people of Inupiaq at the north of Alaska, and so it's a very interesting game which is at the crossroad between the collect of memory and the platform game. And it was a visibility for these people incredible in the whole world. And for now, I see emerge some studios in Africa, in India, that are valorizing their culture. And it's very important. So there is no coincidence here. There's need to valorize the near environment for every studio.
Are there any more questions? Well, thank you all. Oh, one more. When is Dildonia coming out?
I don't know. Spring. The official response is later in spring.
Okay. No, that's something we all have we can look forward to that and enriching our connaissance de Dildonia. So thank you, Danís, for this wonderful talk today and bringing us this opportunity to start thinking about personal initiatives in media making and some of the challenges that come with it. We will stop the talk now.
Well, thanks